Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you very much. So, dear committee members, representatives of civil society, I call to order the informal public meeting of the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women with representatives of non-governmental organizations. Representatives of national and international non-governmental organizations are invited to provide country-specific information on the states parties whose reports are before the committee at informal meetings of the committee, which are held two times during this session. Today, NGOs are invited to provide information on those states parties whose reports are being considered during the second week of the session, namely Mauritius, Tajikistan, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, and Lao People's Democratic Republic. I am pleased to note that NGOs are once again taking advantage of this opportunity to provide information to the committee. This information assists the committee in its consideration of reports submitted by states parties, and we welcome especially the representatives of local NGOs who have traveled to Geneva to brief the committee at this informal meeting. In order to ensure that there will be enough time for an exchange of views between the committee and the NGOs, 10 minutes are allocated for each country. I urge all speakers to respect the time limits allocated for interventions per country to be shared by all NGOs briefing on that country. So I have the list of speakers, and first is Mauritius, and we have Representative Anushka Virashwamy, 4 minutes, and she represents Gender Links Mauritius, Media Watch, Young Queer Alliance, and SOS Fem. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and esteemed members of the CEDAW Committee. This coalition will highlight 4 issues that urgently need the attention of the state and the committee. First issue, the participation of women in politics. Mauritius is doing very badly on women in politics. There are only 2 female ministers on the total of 23 ministers as of date. The Local Government Act seeks to achieve gender neutrality by stipulates that at least 1/3 of the candidates must be either women or men. Women are 52% of the population of Mauritius. There must be a political will to have a gender-neutral quota of 50% for all elections. The Local Government Act should be used for national election with a 50-50 target. All political parties must have gender-neutral quotas of 50% in their constitutions and recognize the discrimination that is being made on women. Our second issue is about sexual health and reproductive rights. Sex is a subject which is still, unfortunately, very much taboo in the Republic of Mauritius. Many young girls and boys do not have access to accurate information on their sexual and reproductive health. It is important to have SRHR as a subject at school for 7 to 19 years old students and address sexual health, teenage pregnancy, menstrual health, abortion and backstreet abortion, contraception, HIV and AIDS and STDs. Additionally, confidential counseling sessions should be provided by trained and reliable staff so that the youth get support and do not drop out of schools. Schools in the Republic of Mauritius should be equipped with clean running water and showers. Toilets should be equipped with sanitary bins and sanitary pads. Third issue, gender-based inclusion. As we speak, Madam Chair, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, girls, women, queer community back home are struggling for their existence. Homelessness, bullying, forced marriage, denial of their identities. Hate has never been so felt against people of the queer community during these years. Cancel Pride March, followed by death threats, where the perpetrators are yet to be held accountable. We have to get on one thing straight. Human rights is not optional. The young female adults from Gender Links Halfway Home are all victims of emotional, sexual, physical violence and are struggling to find their place in society. They are not viewed as domestic violence cases, and the halfway home does not get any help from the state for the young adults. Same applies to the handicapped people who cannot go to school or work, as there are no infrastructural facilities for them. We therefore urge you in supporting a responsive mechanism to include the marginalized community in Mauritius. Fourth issue, abortion and support. The criminal codes were amended in 2012 to provide for the termination of pregnancy under 4 specific circumstances. In addition, government should strengthen national health system, implement sex education in and out of schools, provide affordable, safe contraception, and address the root cause of teenage pregnancy. This will also limit the cases of backstreet abortions that are done and that very often cause infection that can lead to death. It is worth noting that there are currently no studies and statistics on this issue. The state should stop the ticking the box approach and look at both qualitative and quantitative data holistically. We also recommend that a strong evaluation and monitoring mechanism is put in place to show qualitative progress. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. And now invite to speak Nargis Bundun, and she represents independent barrister in collaboration with Musawa, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, distinguished members of the committee, I will be discussing the issues of Muslim religious marriages, child marriages, and domestic violence. On the issue of Muslim religious marriage and child marriages, the exception to the non-discrimination section of the Mauritius Constitution remains. The amendment of Section 16(4)(c), which provides for an exception to the non-discrimination provision in cases of personal status matters, has been an issue for this committee since 2011. It has again been raised for the present review. To date, the legislator has not announced whether it plans to proceed with any constitutional reform, nor has the Muslim Family Council made any recommendation and/or assessment regarding this amendment. The Mauritian state has not codified a comprehensive personal status law, leaving Muslim women in religious marriages without legal recognition or rights. Religious marriages are not registered by any state authority. Registration is a basic protection. Requiring an authority to monitor marriages ensures that both spouses are not already married and enables the state to track and prevent child marriage. Registration also lays the foundation for substantive rights. Without registration, marriages are not recognized as existing. Religious marriages are not subject to civil marriage laws, and courts do not rule consistently on issues such as custody and survival rights. This legal ambiguity increases inequality and further subordinates Muslim women in Mauritius. The long-term security that legal rights can provide women is worth the uphill battle of subjecting religious values to public and judicial scrutiny. This scrutiny holds religious communities accountable to Mauritian values of non-discrimination and freedom to practice religion, and to the Sharia values of equality and justice. The Mauritian state must strive to codify a comprehensive personal status law to protect women in Muslim religious marriages. There is no minimum age for religious marriages, leaving young girls vulnerable to child marriages. The most recent example came to light in June 2018 when a 13-year-old girl who was married in a religious ceremony to a 19-year-old man died due to health complications while pregnant. Such tragedies cannot be permitted to continue. The Civil Code allows children aged 16-18 to be married with consent of a parent or a judge. In 2014, there were 805 documented marriages of children aged 15 to 19 in Mauritius, the majority of whom were girls. Girls suffer disproportionately from child marriage, risking their health and educational opportunities. A clear ban of child marriage for children under the age of 18 is a critical step in protecting children and reducing discrimination against girls in Mauritius. The state has to leverage its robust framework of diversity and inclusion. It should provide for equality for Muslim women and take concrete steps to ensure all women in Mauritius enjoy full legal protection and empowerment. It should eliminate the civil law exception for marriages at age 16 and pass legislation to establish an absolute minimum age of marriage of 18 years for both civil and religious marriages. On domestic violence, Mauritius domestic violence legislation, with the amendments brought in the past years, is strong and caters for all situations, including the protection of children and protection from in-laws and opposite-sex spouses receiving a very wide definition. Subject to interpretation, it can cover marital rape. However, the following issues still prevail. Mauritius is a male-dominated patriarchal society. We have had cases where victims of domestic violence have been assaulted to death, despite being under the cover of protection orders. The lower judiciary is the responsible enforcing authority. Judges are often overworked, young, inexperienced, and lack training. Law practitioners representing the perpetrators tend to be obtrusive and/or legalistic in their approach. The state should take appropriate steps to enforce the law and bring the perpetrator to accountability whilst protecting the victims. It should provide adequate training and a clear framework to the enforcing authorities and law practitioners. It should also raise awareness societally, including disseminating the statute in the school curriculum. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. And now we move to Tajikistan, and I give the floor to Saida Inayatova, 6 minutes, because she represents four NGOs and coalition among them. So please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear Madam Chair, dear members of the committee, we present information on behalf of civil society organizations of Tajikistan. First, there are a number of obstacles on the way to implementation of the CEDAW and gender strategies of Tajikistan as follows: lack of effective mechanisms, absence of regular monitoring and evaluation, weak mainstreaming of needs of different target groups of women, low funding, low gender awareness among public officials, absence of communication strategy on prevention of gender stereotypes. Second, key problem is unequal access of women to all kinds of resources. Education level of men is increasing, but level of education of women is decreasing. Level of professional education among young women is decreasing compared to elder generation of women. Share of women among all employed decreased to 40%. Majority of women work in low-paid sectors. The majority of workforce in agriculture is women, but in reality the right to possess and dispose the land mainly belongs to men. Women have limited access to loans. We recommend, in line with SDGs, conduct gender review of sectoral legislation and program on employment, education, civil service, and so on, to establish effective mechanisms of implementation of status guarantees on equal opportunities for women and men, and develop measures on specific mechanisms in each sector. These measures should be supported with measurable system of indicators. Regular monitoring and evaluation of implementation of these measures should be conducted. Develop special programs on training and retraining of women on technological and economic subjects with focus on women who wish to return to labor market after long child care breaks. Third, men dominate in public bodies at all levels. Share of women among public servants is about 22%. We recommend establish full database of competent women out of human resource reserve of civil servants and regularly track their appointment to positions including management positions in law enforcement bodies and security sector. Fourth, measures taken by the government on elimination of gender-based violence are not effective due to the following reasons. Domestic violence is not criminalized, legal remedies are not effective, and access of victims of domestic violence to justice is restricted. Low understanding of importance of this problem by the society and public officials, law enforcement bodies, weak introduction of multi-sectoral approach to work on prevention and fight with domestic violence, absence of single coordinated body, competent to manage all bodies responsible for prevention of domestic violence. Shortcomings of the law of Tajikistan on prevention of domestic violence, specifically absence of effective mechanisms of its implementation. We recommend develop comprehensive response system to gender-based violence, including domestic violence, by means of improvement of legislation and criminalization of domestic violence and facilitation of access of victims of domestic violence to effective legal remedies, and holding community programs on provision of shelters, psychological and other types of support. Fifth, national legislation includes special provisions on social protection and support of former prisoners, but there are no special legal provisions and state programs on support and social rehabilitation of former prisoners, including women former prisoners, state temporary shelters, legal, healthcare, psychological and other support. Constitution of Tajikistan includes principles of non-discrimination, but separate anti-discrimination law was not adopted. Former prisoners face problems with finding jobs, housing, obtaining identified documents due to lack of funding, stigma and discrimination. We recommend adopt state program on social rehabilitation of former prisoners, which will have gender mainstreaming approaches. Consider adoption of the special law on social rehabilitation of former prisoners. Sixth, women and girls with disabilities face multiple discrimination due to their gender, disability, and often poverty as well. We are also concerned that a strong emphasis on institutionalization persists. Tajikistan should urgently take the following steps: ratify Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, ensure that women and girls with disabilities have access to education, work, health care and social security on an equal basis with others. Introduce the following legislative changes: adopt comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation and transfer the burden of proof to the state. Include disability in the list of prohibited grounds for discrimination. Bring the definition of disability into line with international human rights law and include mental impairments. Repeal legislation and practice of issuance of medical certificates on persons' ability to work when establishing the disability status. Finally, set up an independent mechanism to monitor semi-closed facilities housing persons with disabilities and conduct effective investigations into alleged human rights violations. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Tajikistan Network of Women Living with HIV is represented by Takhmina Haydarova, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm a woman living with HIV and represent women from my community in Tajikistan. The National HIV Programme reflects only the issues of women with HIV in terms of HIV prevention among sex workers and mother-to-child transmission. The programme doesn't cover the issue of HIV feminization, and the increase in sexual modes of HIV transmission through the lens of gender inequality does not take into account the fact that women do not make decisions on condom use. We recommend make changes to the National HIV Programme and provide funding for comprehensive services for prevention, care and treatment for women and girls living with and/or vulnerable to HIV, taking into account gender dimensions. Develop a national plan to reduce discrimination against people living with HIV, addressing the needs of women and girls living with HIV. According to a government decree, HIV-positive women cannot adopt a child or be a guardian, and this is a violation of the women's right to motherhood. Women living with HIV often experience institutional, including obstetric violence in healthcare settings, because they can no longer bear children, that they should marry only a HIV-infected man. Men are selected in the special AIDS centres, and that they shouldn't even marry or have sex. We recommend provide specific anti-discrimination measures for women living with HIV in the reproductive health policy, including pregnant women, to protect their reproductive health and rights, and exclude HIV infection from the list of diseases prohibiting child adoption. Very often women with HIV experience violence in the family. Husbands prohibit women from seeking treatment due to fear of publicity, discrimination and additional costs. If the husband doesn't have HIV and the wife does, she's thrown out of the house with the children. A woman is also discriminated against after the death of her husband and is not even recognised in her own families. Women are forced to endure daily violence and insults from the family members of the husband, especially in rural areas. We recommend make changes to the law on the prevention of domestic violence, with particular attention to the specialised health services and free legal assistance to women living with HIV and other vulnerable groups of women. Include in the state programme for the prevention of domestic violence for 2014-2023 interventions for women living with HIV and women from HIV-affected groups, aiming at protecting them from discrimination and to raise public awareness about HIV, in particular about modes of HIV transmission. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And Marina Avramenko, she has 2 minutes and she represents 2 NGOs. Just please do not speak too quickly. Yes, please.
Спасибо, госпожа председатель.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm representing sex workers of Tajikistan. I'd like to draw your attention to 3 problems.
Actually, we will have a little bit more time, so you can have, let's say, 3 minutes. But please now, because there is an interpretation in a way, they cannot make translation for us. So please.
Thank you. Я представляю.
I represent sex workers in Tajikistan. I'd like to draw your attention to 3 problems: strengthened, heightened punishment for sex work, violence against sex workers, and forced HIV and STI testing of sex workers. So first, the administrative punishment for sex work has been toughened. Contrary to the recommendation of the CEDAW about decriminalisation, fines have doubled up to more than $200 and administrative arrests has been introduced up to 15 days. The police can stop and arbitrarily detain any woman and accuse her of prostitution without any evidence. Often, no protocols on administrative offences are drawn up, and sex workers pay the so-called fines to the police officers directly. Increased sanctions has led to scaling up of violence and extortion by the police, and this is the second problem. Police officers break into people's houses, they illegally take women to police stations, they threaten them, extort money from them, they force them to testify against themselves, they take fingerprints. The police sometimes rape women, they take away their personal belongings and use torture, all this accompanied by humiliation and insults. So-called morality lessons are conducted for arrested sex workers, during which they're taught the correct lifestyles. It's also a form of gender-based violence due to the patriarchy. Also, policemen send letters to relatives of sex workers demanding them to force women to stop prostitution. Often, after such letters, the relatives will then beat the girls up. Thirdly, forced HIV and STI testing of sex workers continues as before during police raids. This practice is facilitated due to discriminatory norms in public health legislation. We urge the CEDAW committee to recommend as follows: repeal the article prostitution from the Code of Administrative Offences, ensure proper investigation of violence by the police and other state and non-state actors, and subsequent bring to justice the perpetrators of such violence. 3. Stop the practice of forced testing of sex workers for HIV and STIs, as well as repeal discriminatory norms in public health legislation. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last speaker for Tajikistan is Inessa Sahno. And again, it's 2 minutes, but please keep in mind and talk a little bit slowly. It's 3 minutes, so please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. While Tajikistan remains among the 3 poorest countries of post-Soviet territories, Tajik labor legislation contains discriminative bans for women. Article 216 of the Labour Code strictly bans employment of women on hazardous and underground works with harmful working conditions. Recently, the professional bans for women were readopted by Governmental Regulation number 179 of April 2017, list of occupations banned for women and the approved limits for the lifting and moving of heavy objects for them. According to it, 326 professions are still closed to women, including well-paid jobs. Taking into account lack of workplaces in the country, mostly men are going to migration, while women stay home completely dependent from money transferred by husband. Quite often men are divorcing while being in migration. Lack of education, especially for girls and women, leads to decreasing possibilities to find any job in Tajikistan. As a result, women, most likely with small children, living in the family of husband, are considered as unnecessary extra expenses. Frequently, they experience abusive treatment, domestic violence, and even appear to be victims of sexual exploitation. Women who decided to go to migration themselves are often considered as women of dissolved life. After returning back, they don't receive any support from the government and barely can find work in Tajikistan. Women going in migration with their families find themselves in hardly better situation. Often they just stay at home. They faced arbitrary actions of the police and migration authorities. Gender-based prejudices are harmful practices, and harmful practices are widespread in Tajikistan. Women giving birth to girls can be left by their husbands. Under the pressure of members of family and due to the poverty, girls and women are frequently forced to make decisions in favor of marriage instead of education. Girls from marginalized ethnic minorities like Mughal are especially vulnerable. Women belonging to Pamiri minorities who traditionally have more freedom in receiving education or working also face prejudices and stigmatization from the Tajik majority. Lesbophobia and transphobia are widely spread in the traditional society of Tajikistan. Women are discriminated in everyday life on the grounds of their sexual orientation or gender identity by the society, by their family, as well as by the representatives of the governmental officials. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we move to Macedonia. And this is coalition of NGOs from Macedonia and the representative Maria Gelevska, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Distinguished members of the committee, I would like to bring attention to the following issues of concern. First, national machinery for the advancement of women, discrimination and gender-based violence, access to health care and services, discrimination of women in employment. First, the inadequate implementation of the law and strategy on gender equality in continuity implies weak and non-functional gender machinery mechanisms. In addition, strategy and national action plans were only partially implemented. For instance, in 2040, only 21% of the planned activities of the National Action Plan were implemented, while in 2016, only 13%. Additionally, the new National Action Plan has been adopted with 18 months delay, thus hindering the enforcement of the gender equality legislation. The most concerning is that the implementation of the gender equality policy continues to exclusively depend on foreign financial assistance. Women participation and representation in politics and positions of power are not on a satisfactory level. Where there are no quotas, significant gender gaps exist. In the government, from 25 ministerial positions, only 4 are women, and from 81 municipalities, only 6 are run by women mayors. Second, the women in Macedonia remain discriminated in all spheres of the Convention. The state failed to address all forms of gender-based violence in accordance to the General Recommendation 35. State institutions have failed to provide urgent protection and propose temporary measures for domestic violence in 24 hours due to the lack of institutional capacities to access the risk and lack of gender-sensitive support to victims. Moreover, in the period from 2008 to 2016, 70 women have been killed, from which 51 can be qualified as femicide. More than 80% of these women were killed by their intimate partners. The criminal prosecution for the criminal offense bodily injury in domestic violence depends solely on victims' consent. Criminal sanctions in most convictions for domestic violence are suspended sentences. Right to compensation for gender-based violence, including victims of trafficking, cannot be enforced because the offenders do not own property or have any money. At present, the right to compensation through a state fund is available only to minors victims. Third, women's access to quality health care and health-related services remain restricted. One of the main barriers related to sexual and reproductive health and rights that women in Macedonia face are access to safe and legal abortion and contraception. Series of legal restrictive and ideologically based requirements were introduced by the Macedonian government in 2013. These requirements include a 3-day mandatory waiting period, high penalties for service providers, and mandatory biased counseling, which requires listening to the fetal heartbeat. Although in December 2017, new government established an expert group to review this law, still new draft of the law is not prepared. On the other hand, the usage rate of modern contraception among women continues to be very low at just 12%, and none of contraceptive methods is covered by the state health insurance fund. The state is also failing to provide access to health for women prisoners, especially having in mind their gender-specific health needs, which go beyond pregnancy and prenatal and postnatal care, such as preventive screenings for breast and cervical cancer. During 2018, several deaths of women prisoners have been reported. One woman prisoner diagnosed with cancer died after was held in her room for 2 months without medical assistance and needed treatment. 4. The position of women in the labor market remains alarming. Women make up 65% of the overall economically inactive population. Research in the country indicates that high economic inactivity of women is linked with the unpaid care work performed predominantly by women, which is unrecognized by the state. The state is failing to provide effective mechanisms for protection of the labor rights of the garment workers, predominantly women, which is resulting with continuous violation of their labor rights. The violations are mostly related to unpaid salaries or paid salaries lower than the legally determined minimum salary, unpaid overtime hours of work, unlawful termination of employment, mobbing, and working in inadequate health and sanitary conditions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Biljana Ginova, and she represents Helsinki Committee for Human Rights of Republic of Macedonia, LGBTI Support Center and Coalition Margins, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Distinguished committee members, with this statement, I would like to bring attention to 3 areas of concern for us. First, violence and discrimination against lesbians, bisexual women and trans people. Second, homophobia, lesbophobia and transphobia in education. And third, access to legal gender recognition. Sexual orientation and gender identity are not recognized as prohibited grounds in the anti-discrimination legislation and in the criminal code. The failure of the state to adequately investigate the cases of discrimination and violation and violence against LGBT people perpetuate the culture of impunity and encourages more violence. Only 3 weeks ago, a lesbian woman was brutally attacked by her father. The police advised her to choose between her family and her partner and sent her home, where she was kept locked without access to phone or internet for days after this event. Second, the state failed to introduce mandatory age-appropriate sexuality education in primary and secondary schools. Instead, a significant number of textbooks promote discrimination based on gender, gender identity and sexual orientation. In addition, bullying in schools is one of the key problems of LGBT young people. However, the Ministry of Education and Science failed to recognize sexual and gender minorities in the comprehensive education strategy and to take appropriate measures to address homophobic and transphobic bullying in education. And finally, there is neither clear legislation nor meaningful practice allowing trans people to conform their personal identity documents to their actual gender identity. The lack of legal gender recognition leads to arbitrary decisions by the civil registry. And with this legal insecurity, only 3 trans people have succeeded in assessing their rights to legal gender recognition. Therefore, we emphasize the need of these issues to be raised by this committee to address the violence and discrimination experienced by LGBT people in Macedonia. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, committee members.
Thank you very much. And now I invite Janko Dbojevic. Yes, do not rush. It can be some more seconds. So she represents 4, I believe, NGOs. Yes, so the floor is open.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Distinguished committee members, sex work is work. Sex workers are workers. They take care of their body, their life, and their rights. They are men, women, gay, straight, and transgendered. On behalf of the sex work community, I want to share some information to the committee. These cases highlight that sex workers cannot utilize the laws and legal remedies available against discrimination in the rare cases when they choose to pursue court cases. Most sex workers are discouraged to use formal to informal mechanisms for protection of their rights. The discrimination and human rights violations that sex workers experience are due to the intersections of their identity as a woman and as sex workers. The state fails to tackle these forms of discrimination, disadvantaging the groups of women and sex workers. In the absence of functional health care, social and legal systems, sex workers mostly trust the NGOs, which are the major provider of legal aid and other services to sex workers. 68% of sex workers encounter some form of violence as a result of their work. The law sanctions sex workers with misdemeanors against public order for soliciting. The criminal code bans prostitution, mediation, and sanctions their earnings from allowing third party to use sex services not regarding that both sides agree. In practice, all women who choose to work together because of their safety are charged for mediating in prostitution. Our government took over the funding for HIV prevention program for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria in January 2018, but failed to allocate money for their legal services like free gynecological services and information relating to sexual and reproductive rights and health. We urge the committee to recommend to our government to repeal this law that sanctions sex workers and allocate more resources for their legal services, but most important of all, their health. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. And now is Salia Bekim Halil, and she will represent Roma women. Please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A lack of data disaggregated by gender, ethnicity, and place of residence, urban or rural, highly impact access to rights of Roma women. Under the Convention influencing needs-based planning and decision-making processes for women at national and local level. We urge the government to end persistent practices of Roma women, statelessness or lack of birth registration and personal documentation as prerequisite to access fundamental rights and decent living. We urge the government to intensify the efforts to make available access to free legal aid, formal and non-formal education, positive temporary measures to boost employment, to increase the social welfare, and to intensify the efforts to implement assistance and support for the reintegration of returnees in the country. The infant mortality rate in the country is 9.2 deaths per 1,000 live births, or 2.6 higher in comparison with EU countries, and the mortality rate among Roma. Mother is even higher. Although current laws allows every woman to receive entirely free of charge services from her selected primary gynecologist, in reality, there is widespread practice of charging illegal fees among Roma. The annual researches among Roma women in the past 6 years have shown that more than 60% of Roma women were illegally charged by their gynecologist. The large number of documented cases of illegal charging and the inaction on the state to eliminate them in a systematic way illustrate the failure of the state to protect women, especially Roma. We urge the government to undertake systematic measures to eliminate widespread illegal charges for health services provided by the gynecologists by defining a funding model for primary healthcare gynecology that is in favor of Roma women and other socially excluded women. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Biljana Petrovka-Mitrevska, she represents National Federation of Farmers, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The women in rural areas are invisible, marginalized, and left to fight for survival on their own. That's how women in rural areas look like, forgotten by their own state. Social exclusion, unemployment, gender discrimination, unequal distribution of incomes and resources, the dominance of traditional norms, deprivation of ownership of agricultural land and property, deprivation of the right to maternity leave, limited approaches and offer of education, information, public and social services and health care. Rural women visited gynecologists once in every 5 years or even rarely. Such conditions push the women in rural areas into great poverty and encourage migration. Women rarely appear as owners of any property. 3 out of 4 women in rural areas are unpaid. Highest rates of unemployment are young rural women. Around 64% of women in rural areas are not active in the labor market because of their engagement in the household and care for children. 47% of unemployed rural women are performing unpaid work in family farms. Data shows that women in rural areas spend most of their time, 4 hours, on household unpaid activities, while they spend 1 hour per day on activities that allow them to earn financial profit. We request from our government to establish a set of economical measures to increase the opportunity for employment of women in rural areas, measures that will recognize the unpaid labor of women for family care and work on agriculture field. And solution also, it is very important for rural women who do not meet the conditions to have right to a pension. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much. And now we have one representative from Lao People's Democratic Republic, and this is Gyanu Gurung from Asia Pacific Network of Sex Workers, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today, on behalf of Asia Pacific Network of Sex Workers, I am here to present the key issues of Laotian sex worker, and the statement pertains to the rights context of Laotian sex worker working in Laos and Thailand. Firstly, I would like to draw the attention of CEDAW committee that the sex work is criminalized in Laos. Yet, nearly 11,000 Laotian women are estimated to be engaged in the sector as per Lao PDR CEDAW State Report 2017. The criminalizations of sex work in itself constitute an overarching systematic discrimination against women, which leads to gross violations of sex workers' human rights in many areas of their lives. So, we highly urge to decriminalize all aspects of consensual adult sex work, clearly differentiating it from human trafficking, recognize that criminalization constitutes a severe intersectional discrimination against rural, low-income, migrant, and trans women. Secondly, the Laotian sex workers face grave violations of labor rights within and outside the country and face harassed economic inequality. in order to safeguard the labor rights and economic exploitations of Laotian sex workers within and outside the country, we highly recommend for the development of unified Thai and Laotian government policies to decriminalize sex work, ensure safe migration, and decent work standards for sex workers. Thirdly, sex workers, especially transgender sex workers, are highly vulnerable to physical and sexual violence, including forced, unprotected sex from clients and the police. We urge to recognize the equal rights, non-discrimination, and anti-hate crime legislation, decriminalize sex work, and national policies relating to rescue, rehabilitations, reintegration, and to ensure that all survivors of violence and exploitations have access to justice in country. Fourth, sex workers face intense stigmatizations and gender stereotyping due to their work, which hinder their ability to enjoy family and professional life. We recommend to incentivize gender equality and human rights education for the general public, decriminalize sex work, and combat stigmatizations of sex workers. Fifth, the criminalizations of sex work and crackdowns on undocumented migrations increase health and safety risks for sex workers. Develop and introduce health insurance and social security scheme that will broaden the access of sex workers, trans women, migrants, and HIV-positive women to a broad range of high-quality, affordable, and non-discriminatory health services, including counseling and support for mental health, and ensure safe migration for women. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. And now the floor is open for questions to be posed by a number of experts. So, Madame Améline, please.
Madame la Présidente, je souhaiterais...
Thank you, Madam Chair. On Tajikistan, 2 questions. I want to thank, obviously, the NGOs for their presentations. What are the chances of obtaining the adoption of the law on discrimination, the general law, which is expected? I've mentioned it a number of times. Is there any genuine hope, do you think, of that being adopted? Secondly, what do you make of the latest arrangements regarding the profession of lawyers? Seems to me there are major restrictions on the right to defence, which is currently being enacted in Tajikistan, where, well, although the official discourse would suggest otherwise, but what is the genuine situation on the ground of the number of lawyers there are and their conditions for exercising their profession? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madame Chalal, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to ask about Mauritius. I did not find anything regarding human rights defenders' situation, so I would welcome some clarifications on that. And also, I'd like to know about the draft law on children that was supposed to prohibit all forms of corporal punishment, and there was a national action plan to combat trafficking, which had been drawn up and was due to be adopted. What stage is that at? And finally, I would welcome statistics on religious marriage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madame Kadari, please.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank all the NGOs for providing important and useful information. To NGOs from Mauritius, primarily, the issue of religious unregistered marriages. You say you acknowledge that what you expect of the government involves a political battle of subjecting religious values to public and judicial scrutiny, and you want the state to codify a comprehensive personal status law. But we understood from you that you actually do not want a separate system of recognized religious law that would operate independently, maybe under the scrutiny of the state. You actually want the religious marriages to be subject to civil law. So could you please be more specific? Do you only want the state to recognize, to give the value, the stamp of recognition to religious marriages, but then all the marriage and the substance and the disputes involving marriages would all be under the civil law? I also want to ask specifically about the issue of marital rape. You say that theoretically the law can be interpreted as covering marital rape at the moment. Have there been prosecutions of marital rape, and have there been attempts to clarify marital rape, to adopt a specific legislation that criminalizes marital rape? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madam Haidar, please.
Madam Chair, and I would like also to thank all the presenter and their valuable input. I would like to address my question to two countries, Mauritius and Tajikistan. For Mauritius, I would like to try to understand the issue of the recent statement of the minister about if women are subject to domestic violence, they have to leave home. And at the same time, the little information we have on shelters. If I understand, there's only one state-run shelter. And is there any shelter when they leave home, and how this can be handled? And my second question to Tajikistan is in relation to women in the labor force, because it is really alarming to see that between the last dialogue and this dialogue, almost half the labor force, the women labor force, has been reduced almost by half. This is extremely concerning and worrying, because we know that empowerment, let alone that we want equal pay, let alone that we want the best condition, but the fact that it has dropped so much means that more of them are in the informal sector, there is still this unpaid work. And I would like to know also how much this issue of lack of preschool institution in rural areas is an impediment for accessing women and former labor market. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Madam Schulz, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to take advantage of this last opportunity for me to thank the representatives of the four countries. You bring us indispensable information, and you bring us your views. You enrich our understanding of the situation in your countries, and you support our efforts to draft observations and recommendations that are country-specific and address the situation of women in a precise way. You also make us aware of new issues or of the persistence of well-known problems. I would like to thank you for your efforts, your courage, your persistence, your activism. And I now have a question to the NGOs of Mauritius. I would like to know how you evaluate our chance of at last getting the Mauritius government and parliament to move on the deletion or revision of Article 16, paragraph 4, letter C of the Constitution. This issue has been dealt with since the first dialogue. I have gone through all the COBs. So it's 95, 2006, 2011, and now we are in 2018. So is there a time frame? Is there any will that you can detect on the side of the political authorities? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Madame Verges, please.
Merci, Présidente.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank the civil society representatives for this important exchange of information. I have two questions, one on Mauritius, the other on Tajikistan. For Mauritius, I would like to ask about the right to nationality. I did not hear the civil society representatives mention that, and my question is regarding the right to transmit nationality. It appears that, for example, a man married to a foreign woman can systematically transmit nationality to his children, but for women it is on a case-by-case basis, and where minor is adopted by a man, the man can transmit his nationality, while that is not the case if adopted by a woman. So I would like to hear what Mauritian civil society can tell us about the right to nationality, whether there is discrimination in that respect. And my second question pertains to Tajikistan regarding education. I heard the civil society representative state that there was a difference in teaching level or educational level between men and women. Does that refer to literacy or grades achieved or grades completed? And what is the cause of the difference? Does it happen in primary, secondary, or tertiary education? Or is there a lack of effort by the state on that? And as regards professional training, it was mentioned that there was a reduction of professional training compared to previous generations. I was wondering what the civil society representatives felt was the cause of that reduction among women. And I would like to know whether the educational system in Tajikistan incorporates sexual education. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madame Gaber, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the NGOs for the information. I would like to ask about Tajikistan and gender stereotyping and negative images of women, as well as violence against women. Could civil society work with the government or with the mechanisms responsible for women's rights in order to combat these stereotypes and violence against women? Thank you.
Thank you very much for all questions that have been posed to the civil society. And now I kindly ask for your responses in an order of countries like this, like following: Mauritius, Tajikistan, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, and Lao People's Democratic Republic. And please, if you have more meaning than one speaker within the group, please manage yourself. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Anushka from Mauritius. So I'm going to tackle the question more on what the Minister said about subject of domestic violence and having shelters. It is true that in Mauritius we've got 3 shelters for domestic violence. There are only 3. And what is happening today is that when a woman has been beaten or needs a shelter, they go straight there, and prior to going there, they need to go to the police to get what do you call that? Yeah, I mean a form from the police to say that they've been beaten up. Then they are put in a shelter, and they stay there for a definite amount of time. Now, the system itself is not good in the sense that the perpetrators get to stay at home, while the victim, the survivor, would have to leave. So definitely this is something not very good. And what we want to bring together is all about that kind of empowerment and giving information to women who have known violence, which is a bit slow. So yes, definitely this is something which we need to work on.
Okay, I will. statistics on religious marriages as at date. As regards the issues, what we would like as NGOs regarding religious marriages, we need to separate two steps. Probably the first initial steps in the very short term would be to impress upon the state to reinstate the 10 articles of the Civil Code, which were in force between 1982 up to 1987. And do we want the civil law to apply to all religious marriages? Not in the long term. Probably we are urging the states to codify the personal law. As regards marital rape, this is a definition under the Protection from Domestic Violence Act. As at date, there has been no prosecution for marital rape. It was a very unfortunate comment that the Minister of Gender made regarding the fact that women should leave the house when they have been victims of domestic violence. There has been definitely an outcry in the media on such a declaration. As regards the amendment to be brought to the Article 16(4)(c) of the Constitution, as at date, all governments since 1995 to date have not given any indication as to whether they wish or not to amend this section. On the issue of nationality, our law have been amended since a while now. We are now at par. Both men and women who are married to non-citizens can transmit Mauritian citizenship. As regards adoption by a Mauritian male, this is still very much the case, but I think it was primarily probably through an oversight of the legislator. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Tajikistan, please.
Уважаемые члены комитета.
Thank you. There was a question about adoption of the law to combat discrimination. There is a parliamentary working group to examine the issue of adoption of a special law to combat discrimination, which is working with international organizations and local civil society. The issue is included in the National Plan for Implementation of the recommendations from the UPR. Thank you.
Добрый день.
Thank you. As regards measures taken to reform the activity of lawyers, under the new legislation, there is limited access to the professions, so lawyers can accede through an exam under the Ministry of Education. It is a state commission headed by the Deputy Justice Minister. I'm sorry, I should have spoken of the Justice Ministry, says the Speaker. Likewise, there are restrictions on the activities of lawyers, and under the criminal procedures legislation, lawyers within criminal cases upon which they're working may have cases brought against them by investigators. This depends on the investigation authorities. That is as regards lawyers. Now, as regards the failings of the preschool system, that is the case in rural locations, and it is an obstacle. But as regards statistics, it is difficult to provide precise information at the moment, so we will do some research on that and provide it. But in addition to that, there are other obstacles which together are an obstacle to women achieving formal employment, particularly in rural areas. In terms of the reduction in literacy, this not only affects the formal education system in terms of diplomas achieved, but also literacy as a whole. Girls are being restricted in access to internet resources because of gender stereotyping. And in terms of the levels of education achieved. In primary education, and once more, we will provide more precise information later, but in primary education, the situation is better than in, for example, higher education or vocational. Most girls drop out of education once they have finished middle school. The reasons are, again, gender stereotyping in society, which takes the view that girls do not need higher education or vocational education because their task is to be a good wife and a good mother. The main function for women, it is felt, is that. And many girls who achieve higher education then have to abandon their studies when they marry, because the husband's relatives or the husband himself insist. Unfortunately, there is a very strong trend towards that. There was a question about gender stereotyping and violence, and whether civil society could show mechanisms to impact on that. In Tajikistan, there has not yet been a strategy to combat gender stereotyping developed on the basis of the 2013 recommendation. There is a plan to combat violence in the family, and that, according to the government, is supposed to cover gender stereotyping as well. But currently there is monitoring of that state program, which will show the effectiveness of the program. Overall, there are no effective mechanisms, including to address violence as a whole or domestic violence, as can be seen from the alternative report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Macedonia, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, but there were no questions for Macedonia, unfortunately. But thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Then, Laura, please.
But there is also no any questions for the Lao. Thank you.
Okay. So it concludes our meeting, our public informal interactive discussion. Thank you very much for arriving here, for briefing us and informing us. So this meeting is adjourned. Yes, and since we do not have any representatives of national human rights institutions from the country under consideration this week, so we have to switch from public meeting to private meeting, and it will take 5 minutes. Thank you very much.